Leontine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Darko. Thank you very much. As Darko said, I'm going to talk about the Netherlands. Those of you who were there yesterday already heard from Joris about the Netherlands. That was about the Italian process. My reform was a little bit earlier, and I'm talking about the e-voting, or currently the lack of e-voting in the Netherlands, and how that came to be. As a disclaimer, I was working at the Ministry of the Interior when all this happened, and I was in charge of this project. So I'm basically critiquing everything I did back then. So sometimes it's a bit weird, but it's also the nice part of being a practitioner who's gone academic. The Netherlands, we have many parties that participate in parliamentary elections. We also have a preferential choice system. So parties, there's not only a lot of parties, but also a lot of candidates, because you vote for one candidate on a ballot paper. During parliamentary elections, we often have around 30 parties participating, competing, and they can each set up to 80 candidates. So the ballot papers are really, really big because they contain over 2,000 candidates. So what I'm going to present is how we currently vote in the Netherlands. I'm going to keep it very brief on that, because the most interesting thing is how we voted in the past, what happened both with the introduction of the e-voting and the abandonment of the e-voting, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this process meets up or doesn't meet up with the criteria that were set out yesterday and in the introduction by Toby. So currently, this is our counting process. Like I said, we have very large ballot papers at the end of the day. So a voter goes into the polling station, gets a ballot paper, unfolds it 14 times because it's folded 14 times to be able to transport it, marks a candidate somewhere on the ballot paper, folds it back 14 times, stuffs it in a ballot box, and then at the end of the evening, the poll workers have to unfold them all, find the correct mark, and then count them that way. This is a very time-consuming process that was already happening when we introduced our PR system in 1917. So ballot papers became larger and larger and larger. So that's why municipalities in the Netherlands very early on started thinking on how can we make this process easier. So what we had before 2006 is e-voting. E-voting in the traditional sense, in the term of having a voting machine, as we call them, or voting computer in the ballot, in the polling station. So it was not remote e-voting, but it was e-voting done in a controlled environment. This is one of the machines that we used. It's basically a ballot paper, but then on a machine. So you see all the candidates. This is a very small list, by the way. You see all the candidates on the little buttons. For those of you who don't speak Dutch, and I think most of you don't, it says here there is a magnifying glass available with the members of the voting polling station if you need it, because the text on the buttons is very unreadable for most people. You would press a button, the name would come up in this screen, and then you press the red button and vote. And at the end of the day, the polling station officer would close the machine, press the result button. A little ticket came out and said, this is the result of this voting computer. And then he would tally those, he would mark those down results in the paperwork for the polling station and send it upwards. There was no paper trail, and the ticket that came out was the only printout. So how did we end up with those voting machines? Well, like I said, the Netherlands very early on introduced these big ballot papers, and municipalities were very interested in to see, can we make this process easier? Because in the Netherlands, as yours already mentioned, the electoral process is very decentralized. The Ministry of the Interior sets some basic guidelines, but it is left up to the municipalities how they want to organize elections in their own municipality. So there's no set rules on you have to have a polling station for so many voters, or polling stations need to be this or that. There's a lot of options left to municipalities. At least there used to be in the past. So when these municipalities started looking at voting machines, they looked mainly at the US, at the systems in place there. They tried some of them, they didn't like them, and we had a Dutch company that said, the Narda company, that said, we can probably build these machines. They started building them early 1960s, and in 1966, the possibility was opened in the election law for municipalities to choose if they wanted to use forms of technology in the running of the elections. It was really left up to the municipalities to make that choice. So one municipality could say, we are going to do that, and another could say, we're going to stick to paper ballot voting. One of the problems was that the electoral law was very detailed about the paper ballot voting. So it really says in an article, a poller walks into the polling station, he does this, then he gets a ballot paper, then he walks to the polling booth, then he marks the ballot paper, and all those processes, and also the counting process was very detailed in the law on the paper ballot voting. But on the e-voting, it basically the whole law contained 3 paragraphs saying municipalities can choose to do this or not. And then 2 paragraphs that basically dealt with how do we certify these machines. So very little rules on what do we actually expect from these machines. But that is also because they were introduced in 1966, when there was a lot less knowledge about the possible downsides of using e-voting, about transparency, all those nice international norms and standards that we now talk about for an integer election process were not in place in 1966. We basically had Article 3 of the first protocol of the European Convention on Human Rights that said you have to have regular elections that need to be free and fair. But there were no guidelines from the Venice Commission or other international organizations that the Netherlands could use. So we were a very early adapter, which means we kind of had to pioneer it. Although the choice was left to municipalities, basically without a real proper debate on it, more and more municipalities started using these machines, up to the point where in 2006, almost 95% of the Dutch voters voted on voting machines, while the law was still basically based on paper ballot voting. So we replaced one voting system with another without having a fundamental debate in Parliament on this direction that we took. Amsterdam was one of the latest municipalities to change. In Amsterdam, we had a very active hacker community. During the municipal elections of March 2006, Amsterdam decided to use voting machines for the first time. These hackers were confronted with the voting machine in their polling station, and they woke up and said, hey, what's going on? And is this a smart idea? So an NGO was started by them with the title, We Don't Trust Voting Computers. They used Freedom of Information Act requests to get as much information as possible about these voting machines. And they also managed to get their hands on a voting machine so they could tinker with the programming of the machine. And they basically showed that these voting machines were hackable and that they could be hacked in a way where you probably, if you did it a little bit smart, you could influence the result of the election without actually without it being very obvious. And that's also because of our Dutch system with the proportional representation. There's often 2 parties that are really close, but not majority, but the difference in seats is very close. The biggest party usually is the party that can decide who becomes the prime minister. So if you move maybe 10% of the votes from the largest party to the second largest party, then you could sway the outcome of the election without it being very obvious in most of the Dutch elections. Because there's no paper trail, you just have to trust that whatever the machine says at the end of the evening is what actually went in. Another piece of disclaimer, the hacker that ran this NGO was a very good friend of my husband. He managed to get the voting machine in his basement. He reprogrammed the voting machine. I was at that time at the ministry in charge of the certification process. I went to his house. I did the same things that I would normally do with a regular voting machine, and a completely different result came out. And that was the moment that I realized we might be in trouble here. We haven't kept up with the requirements and everything. So what happened, I'll go into a little bit more detail later on, but the cabinet fell not over this, but over a different matter. So we had to have quite quickly parliamentary elections in November 2006, while this debate was going on. So they were the last parliamentary elections where we used the machines, because we couldn't, in the time frame that we had, completely withdraw them at that moment. And then in 2007, the electoral law was changed, and the possibility for municipalities to vote with the machines was taken out. We also had some experiments with internet voting in 2004 and 2006 for voters living abroad. In 2004, they could also vote with telephone, but I think only like a handful of people did it, so it was very expensive to run that whole operation for a couple of voters. But the internet voting was a good success. There was a plan to use the internet voting during water board elections. The water boards are a very old Dutch organization which basically manages the water, which we have a lot of. They have elections because we pay taxes to them, but their turnout is really low, so they plan to use internet voting to get the turnout up. They were planning to use the same system that we're using for voters abroad. Because of the debates on the voting computers, the system was tested, and the testing company said it's not safe. The secrecy of votes can be broken within minutes, and it was possible to cast multiple votes during the voting process. So the certification of the internet system was withdrawn. I'll skip over this at the if we have time. But so, what was the main problems that I draw from this case? Like I said, the introduction of the voting computers happened in a time when convenience was more important than integrity. We thought a lot more about how are we going to make this process easy for voters and municipalities, and not about how do we manage clean elections, because at that time, basically nobody in the Netherlands ever thought about there might be possible fraud during elections with votes. I mean, the trust in elections was really, really high, and I don't think anybody came up with this idea. Another problem was that the ministry lacked technical knowledge. We had 2 Dutch vendors building the machines. They had been in cooperation with the municipalities since the 1960s. They were trusted parties, and they had a very large role in deciding the rules that were set for the voting machines. And basically nobody in the municipality was aware of the actions and that were happening in other technological fields that we should have been aware of with the voting computers. Also, the subject moved quite a lot during to different parts of the municipality, meaning that there was not a buildup of knowledge. People moved in and out of this subject quite often, so there was no history there. Due to the gradual implementation at the municipal level, there were no fundamental debates on the widespread use, nor on the possible issues. So basically it happened, and nobody stopped and thought, is this the right direction that we're taking? So political parties and parliament were not involved in the decision to move basically all voting to electronic voting. And at that time, the Electoral Council only had 1.5 people on staff. They were really understaffed. So they were not a player that actually had a lot of momentum or people to look at the issue. And another thing, voters didn't care. Like I said, these actions happened just before the parliamentary elections in 2006. It was shown on national television that the machine was hackable. We still had to use them. Most municipalities, we still had to use them during those elections. There was a survey done afterwards, and 88% of the voters said they trusted the machines and the outcome. So there was no pressure from voters either to do something about it. Then we had to withdraw the use and the certification. Like I said, 3 weeks before national elections, problems emerged. Due to the time frame, we had no option at the ministry, no other option than to centralize decision making. We had 365 municipalities at that time. We had 3 weeks. We couldn't sit down with every municipality to make an informed decision on, are you going to use your machine under what conditions or not. So we basically said, we are now making the decisions that the law actually leaves up to you. So there was no time to involve municipalities, political parties, voters, or other stakeholders in this process because we had 3 weeks and an election. What we did is we had 2 types of machines. We decided to use the NADAPs. We decided to withdraw the certification of the other type of machine because there was another issue with them. So we had 35 municipalities, including Amsterdam, 3 weeks before the election, who had suddenly had to move back to paper ballot voting. Some of these municipalities had been voting on these computers for almost 20 years. So because of the time frame, there was no trained poll workers. We didn't have time to test stuff with voters. We couldn't train voters, and there was no option for visually impaired voters, whereas with the machines, there was an audio function and they could vote in person. Dutch voters still preferred e-voting, and voters abroad were very happy with the internet voting. So we basically went against public opinion and said, we cannot use this anymore. So there's more in the paper is available online, because otherwise I'm going to take up way too much time and I'd rather have more discussion with you guys. When I put all this towards the criteria, we're not scoring really good. Like I said, the introduction, there wasn't, you can say there was consensus within the municipalities, but there was no consensus on the national level that we should do this other than opening the possibility in the law. There was no transparency about the process. When this NGO tried to figure out which municipality had decided when to start using the machines, there was no documentation on that. They really had to go back to each and individual archive to see. Sometimes it wasn't even clear if the municipal council had actually voted on use of e-voting, or just some civil servant that said, oh, we can do this and introduce it. So there was no transparent process in the decision making. It also meant there's no inclusion. If you don't have a transparent decision making process, it's really hard to include people that actually have an interest in this. Evidence, well, based on what they wanted to achieve, more convenience for voters and poll workers, the choice for e-voting was a good one, but you can wonder if there was enough attention given to technical problems, or possible problems. The timeliness, it's difficult to score because it was introduced at so many different moments in time, but very often pretty close before elections, from what I've seen. And accountability, the municipalities were responsible for this, so you can say that's there. And then if you look at the abandonment, there was consensus on the national level that we should stop it, but there was no consensus within the other stakeholders. The municipalities still wanted to use it. They've been pushing for reintroduction since we've abandoned it. I think there was more transparency because, well, if you have the parliamentary debates, then at least there's transparency about the reasoning. There were also a couple of court cases which were transparent in the Netherlands. Again, no inclusion because we had to do it in 3 weeks. In terms of evidence, again, because it was such a small time frame, there was no real evidence-made decision in terms of weighing the pros and the cons in a really scientific and robust manner. The hacker said it's not safe, and we had no option to say, okay, we believe you and we're gonna change it. I've missed the timeliness here should be a negative instead of a plus. Sorry for that, because, well, 3 weeks before the election is not in accordance with the rules of giving enough time for an electoral reform. And accountability, we took action as a ministry, but the municipality should have been the one that take action. So I was a bit on the fence in this. But then my main problem, or my main question with this case that I would like to discuss also with the group, is looking back, the reform itself was good. I think if you look at the actual risks with the voting machines, there was, I mean, Ireland 1 year later also decided not to use the NADAPs on exactly the same grounds after a thorough debate. Considering the risks and the lack of good rules and knowledge, I think that this decision to stop using these paperless voting computers is also now in line with all the international recommendations on the use of e-voting, It's in line with the decision of the German Bundesverfassungsgericht on not using technology in the process that voters cannot understand. So the reform in itself, I think, was a good one. However, the reform did not meet any of the criteria discussed for a good reform process. So I'm struggling a bit, but how do you comment on such a case where the outcome is good, but the process is severely lacking? And that was it. Darko, your audio is not on.
Thank you, Leontine, very much for this sort of very precise, detailed approach and also anecdotal. It means a lot to know that, you know, there are people that care about the things, and you know, I would challenge the evidence part. I mean, you provided evidence for the process. It's an important observation from what you've just presented. So please, you can ask questions in the chat section, but also we're gonna have some time after Mr. Rekai delivers his notes on within his discussion on the paper to have more debate about this. Okay, next, my pleasure is to announce Ms. Narda Carranza and to hear all about the reform process in Peru. Ms. Carranza, without further ado, please, you can take the floor.
Hi to everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about my research. I'm sorry also for sending my Canva presentation in the chat before. I wasn't aware I was sending it to everyone. So sorry, Leontine, for the disruption there. Well, let's talk about the electoral reform in Peru. I've chosen this period of time from 2022 to 2022 because I think when speaking about reform or electoral reform in Peru, we have between this period, in the beginning and in the end of this period, two big electoral reform moments. So to talk about the context first, we have this long period of democratic continuity from 2002 and 2019 to a context of political instability from 2019 onwards. And we have seen actually since maybe 2016 the effects that the Lavallato case had in our country and actually also at the regional level. From 2019, we have a especially critical moment in politics because after that year, we had many presidential successions due to political crisis. We had a president in 2016 that had to resign after 2 years of mandate. And then we had a vice president that became president, Martín Vizcarra, and he was dismissed after 2 years. And then we had a president for maybe 2 weeks that had to resign. And then we have presidents like we had a president for maybe 6 months or 8 months, and then we had new elections, and the new president was also removed after less than 2 years, and now we have our first female president with the lowest score of popularity here, at least in the region. So we have these two very different phases within this period. And within this period, I find that there are two key reformist moments, two key moments for reform. The first one occurred in the beginning of the period after the dictatorship of Fujimori, when we have this moment of openness, of big electoral reforms, a moment that is perceived as inclusive and the new beginning of democracy here, right? And then we have this second moment of big and ambitious reforms that started in 2019 with Martín Vizcarra's ambitious reform package that included gender parity in candidate lists, restrictions on preferential voting, simultaneous and open primaries. And in the last 2 years, we had a process of counter-reform against some of these reforms, where the Congress has gained a lot of political power and has approved big electoral reforms that are going to be implemented next year in the general election of 2026. So I focus on particular on a reform that was introduced by President Vizcarra in 2019, that is the open and simultaneous primaries reform here. And actually, I've been studying this specific reform of the introduction of open and simultaneous primaries here for the last 4 years. So I want to make a little bit of a comment here, because I never saw this reform within this bigger picture that the analytical framework that Electoral Integrity Project is proposing before. So I want to extend my gratitude, because this new point of view has allowed me to analyze this case in particular about with whom I have this proximity. I have a lot of information around this case, but I never saw like the bigger picture, and now I see new things regarding this type of reform and how it connects to this long process of reforms in this country. So regarding the PASO in Peru, I want to present a little bit of the timeline so we can understand the case better. In 2018, President Vizcarra assumed office after the elected president had to resign. And after a few months, he introduced a constitutional referendum involving political reforms. So he entered the presidency. As a president, he entered that role as a president with a clear reformist vein. And he also wanted to introduce a lot of big and ambitious reform. And he actually called a group of political scientists from Peru to design those reforms. And he forced the Congress to approve many of those reforms in 2019 using a confidence vote. So the Congress didn't have other option and didn't have much time to debate those new law proposals. And many of those new laws have to be approved, including PASO, with small changes, but the version that was approved was almost identical to the one proposed by the executive and their team of political scientists. And then after maybe 1 or 2 months, the president did dissolve the Congress anyways. And then we had a new congressional elections. So many things were happening that year, and not much time was put into debating any of those reforms. So the new Congress in 2020 suspended, but temporarily the PASO. PASO was never implemented, but because it was always suspended up until last year, where it was deleted or suspended officially, permanently. So Vizcarra was removed also, and many congressmen, many political forces nowadays associate this big and ambitious process of reform with Vizcarra, and they are against it because of the way it was approved. So who proposed PASO? Vizcarra created this high-level commission of political reform. He appointed in that commission a group of well-renowned political scientists from Peru. I have put their names here, and they had one goal: to identify what were the main structural problems in Peru political system and electoral system, and propose reforms. So this group of experts proposed PASO, among other reforms, to eliminate weak non-representative parties, to implement a mandatory citizen-driven candidate selection. They want to make a internal selection of candidates more democratic, and they wanted to make parties stronger here. When analyzing the design of PASO here, of these open and simultaneous primaries, it's very similar to the design that PASO has in Argentina. So I track that within this group of political experts, the one that was the leader of that group, the one that had the top position, was very close to policymakers in Argentina. So he, like, since maybe 2016, has been speaking about these good practices that were implemented in Argentina regarding the selection of candidates. So I will be analyzing right now this particular case within the framework. First up is political consensus. This reform process lacked this broad political consensus. It produced two opposing coalitions, actually. We had this reformist coalition that was weak, that came from the executive, and this group of experts. And we had this counter-reformist coalition where political parties didn't want to implement, restrain the implementation of PASO, didn't want to lose control over candidate selection. There was no political consensus because there was no consensus at all in the political realm during this time. I talked before about how the confidence vote was used. This was perceived as a low blow from the executive. The Congress never forgave the executive for that. The Congress actually delayed and suspended PASO. PASO was never implemented, and the resistance ended last year when PASO was finally deleted. Regarding transparency, I think one thing that pops up to me is that the debate in Congress was transparent, because we have a transparency law. Every procedure, every debate is transparent. More from the pandemic. But the level of technicism that the discussion around PASO required didn't allow the bigger public, the citizenry, the media to understand what was being proposed. PASO is is a very rare type of primary here. So, and I think in many of the countries, because we took a case, we took the paso from Argentina, and Argentina is the only country that has this type of primary candidate selection. So people here were very confused about what was going on, what was being proposed, and this led to a very superficial debate around it, very oversimplified narratives. The debates took on the pandemic or general arguments regarding democracy and internal democracy, but no more than that. There wasn't an analysis of how PASO was giving results in Argentina also. Actually, the evidence from Argentina is mixed and sometimes even negative about what PASO was producing over there. So evidence was not used. And I'm talking about evidence also here because, yes, it was transparent. It was a transparent process, but it didn't have another qualities that will make the transparency effective. Regarding inclusion, the mechanism itself is inclusive. It's supposed to improve inclusion in politics within parties specifically, but it lacks a broad stakeholder engagement. You know, we have this small group of experts designing and proposing a law that was approved without much participation of the general public or political parties. It was repealed also without a participatory debate. So the reform and the counter-reform were not very democratic at all in their openness to more voices. And some people argue that PASO actually can improve internal party democracy, but even that argument is right now being put into consideration more because it is being doubted more because the evidence from Argentina, where it has been implemented maybe for more than 10 or 15 years, is very critical regarding the inclusions. It doesn't seem to be a tool that improves inclusion in politics at all. Regarding evidence-based decision-making, I already say that PASO overlooked the empirical evidence. It was more justifying around theoretical arguments than empirical evidence. So when we're talking about evidence-based decision-making, I will say that no, that was lacking here. And that makes me think a lot about what is the role of academia, political scientists, when having a central role in policy making. Because this model was transferred from Argentina without much empirical support, but it had a good reputation and it had something like a theoretical support of theoretical arguments in favor of it. So that, yes.
1 minute, please.
Yes, I'm finished.
We're going to the end. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Next is timeliness and feasibility. I also said that the times were very short due to this political conflict between executive and parliamentary powers, and we didn't have, or I can't see any accountability mechanism accompanying this process. And this is the last slide. Just to summarize, I see many barriers, like weak political and public communication regarding this reform. There was a lot of executive pressure and hasty implementation or implementation intense, lack of evidence-based decision-making, another type of decision-making from academia actually, but not evidence-based, and obviously elite resistance to change due to the nature of the reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and especially for the last slide, which was actually showing some pretty important challenges. I welcome you all to read the paper, which is posted on the web page, and looking forward to all the questions that you may have, especially in terms of the barriers that are elaborated here. Okay, so next we will move to Hungary, and without further ado, Ms. Unger, please share with us your presentation on the electoral reform.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hopefully you see my slides and you also hear me. I mean, it's okay. Thank you. Okay, and thanks for being here. It's really, I guess, the case of Hungary can be interesting for several reasons. Once among the many that a couple of decades earlier, we were the poster child of democratization in Central Europe or East Central Europe. And now we are the poster child of autocratization all around the world, within Europe and also outside Europe. I don't have to explain probably what kind of admiration Viktor Orbán has from Donald Trump and other wannabe autocrats. So it is, I mean, Hungary is interesting again, but I have to add, unfortunately, in many regards. And when I got this invitation to the project, I was thinking a lot about which element of electoral reform should be elaborated in detail in this project, because there are several different elements of the reform that can be interesting and can be analyzed. And after a while, I decided that I will focus on the delimitation process, the boundary delimitation, because it happened twice since 2010. So it happened twice in the time frame we have in this project, and it was always a problematic issue, even since 1989. So this is one of the problems that have been unsolved since the democratic transition, and it can be interesting to compare the two reforms that happened 2011 and 2024. I mean last fall, and to get some, how to say, some conclusions. When it comes to the background, I mean, and when I say background, I really mean the electoral reform. We had the first huge electoral reform in 1989, and it was rather an elite negotiation-based reform than a popular deliberation. The state party and some of the opposition parties made an agreement about the next electoral system, and it was not transparent at all, and it was a kind of compromise among the different parties. And regarding this, since 1989, the elections and the issue of election and representation as a democratic issue, as a democratic concept within Hungarian political system, was mainly elaborated by constitutional lawyers and lawyers in general, and much less by political scientists. So it was rather a legal, technical issue than a purely political issue or topic of our democratic system, and it always had a technocratic approach. So it was not really possible to open wider discussions about, for instance, the number of seats or the number of rounds, how much rounds shall we have, 2 rounds or 1 round or whatever, because we were usually told that this is what the experts know, and they know how to do this. They know how to organize the elections and how to create an electoral system. It's not the business of the people. So it's not, I guess it's not surprising that the people, the everyday people did not really recognize what went on after 2010, when Orbán returned to power with a constitutional majority. We had a parliamentary democracy that I call, and more academics call it also, electoral autocracy since the turn of 2011-14. However, regarding elections, the requirements are quite the same than we had before 2010, which means that voting rights are and the basics of elections are discussed and elaborated and regulated in the constitution or basic law. And in order to change them, it needs, as it always was the case, it needs a 2/3 majority in the parliament. Electoral issues regarding the electoral system, the electoral act, the procedures and referendums have their own specific acts or bills, and they are also passed by 2/3 majority. You cannot amend them without 2/3 majority. And we had a mixed system that contained proportional and majoritarian elements, and we still have a mixed system. However, it changed a lot in 2011. And what kind of reforms, what kind of problems we had before the autocratization and after? I listed four important problems. The first was, and still pretty problematic, the remote voting, which means that if you are not in the country on voting on election day, it is really hard to vote. It was a problem already in 1990, and one of the first decisions, it was the 3rd decision of the Hungarian Constitutional Court that said that it is unconstitutional to restrict the voting rights from those people who are not in the country on electoral day. And probably the biggest shame of the newborn democracy was that instead of providing remote voting, what the parliament did is that they amended the constitution and said that those who are not at home on electoral day, they cannot vote. And that's how they solved the situation of unconstitutional regulation, that they put the unconstitutional story into the constitution, which means that it cannot be unconstitutional anymore, but it was a severe restriction of voting rights. The second is that the delimitation process, which is the real case study of my research, is still unregulated or underregulated and creates a lot of democratic and legal problems. The third is that we lack any regulations for that would somehow talk about how to make electoral reform in general and in particular, which means that no access is provided, for instance, for the stakeholders, for experts like me, for parties who are not part of the parliament, which means that they cannot participate on the parliamentary debates. However, they are affected by the outcomes of the reform. And finally, political financing had a lot of severe problems that were not solved and are not solved yet. What remained after 2011, which was the first huge reform of the electoral system, all of the above, and since then we have to face another problem, which is about the re-democratization of the country. It is pretty hard, because if we want to do it in a legal electoral way, it means that we have to reach 2/3 majority. I mean, when I say me, it means the opposition. It refers to those who want to democratize the country. However, the competitive nature of the elections are extremely limited or distorted, and it's not only my opinion. If you read the electoral observation reports from Hungary since 2010, you can read a lot of complaints and recommendations from the OSCE delegation, who put the issue of Hungarian reforms and Hungarian elections several times. I mentioned that it is very unequal and uneven. The other problem is that the governing party, which has 2/3 majority since 2010, they can use this kind of politics of sticks and carrots at the same time. They can punish those who would who can be real threats to the 2/3 majority. However, they can put a lot of incentives into the system, like carrots, that may help minor opposition parties to stay in the competition, to remain in the system in order to divide, to fragment the opposition, which is absolutely against the options and the possibilities to restore democracy and to get rid of 2/3 majority Fidesz. And for me, the most interesting part of this whole electoral issue in Hungary is that though I mentioned 2 big reforms from 2011 and 24, actually we live in a constant electoral reform since 2011. I cannot mention a year that lacked or missed any electoral reform. It is quite regular that year by year, Fidesz changes something, and something major, like the rules of candidacy, like the rules of campaign finance, like the rule of, I don't know, the number of votes, like the access to electoral complaint, the rules regarding EMBs or litigation after. So we live in a constant, never-ending electoral reform that serves as a permanent fine-tuning the system in order to reach the next and to ensure the next 2/3 majority for Fidesz. And why this 2/3 majority matters? Because they need 2/3 majority to maintain the situation, to keep political power, constitutional political power in the parliament, and to keep this, as Schädler calls it in his book about electoral autocracy, to keep the role of sovereign player, that they are in this situation, they are in this position that they can organize and they can do whatever they want. And if they do not win as players, they can change the rules as lawmakers. And if it's not enough, they can make decisions as judges who will say that it was unfair. Here in this table, you can see the basics of the differences and the basics of the electoral system. I tried to collect them according to key features of elections, like issues around voting rights, who have rights, who have no rights, the key natures of the electoral system, the procedure, the delimitation process in particular, and the reforms, what we know about the reforms. I won't tell all these cells in detail. All I want to explain that that we have a lot of issues that could be solved and or changed. However, there is no 2/3 majority in the parliament, only for Fidesz. So this is an extremely one-party reform and one-party legislation and one-party constitutional making since 2011. And okay, how reforms happen, and I try to summarize my findings according to the characteristics and the factors that Toby and as mentioned in the frame of the book. The general patterns are that there is no deliberation. I mean, which means that expert stakeholders have no idea what would come. Now we are here, and it can easily happen that late night this evening someone will introduce a bill and it will be passed tomorrow. That, for instance, excludes women without child from suffrage. It can easily happen. Why it can happen? Because the government doesn't respect its own constitution, I mean basic law and lawmaking rules, because they usually use these individual parliamentary member proposals instead of the classic legislation process when it's the government that proposes the bill. However, if it's the government, they have to hold a wide-ranged social deliberation during the process. However, if it's a member of the parliament who individually proposes a bill, all these social deliberations are not needed, and that's why we have very short time framed electoral reforms. Sometimes they can happen overnight, which I know it sounds weird, especially in the middle of the EU. However, this is the regular reform, electoral reform making in Hungary. It is also very problematic that though there is this kind of rule that within 1 year for the next general election, you shouldn't change the basic rules. It was never respected. It has never been respected, and it's not respected right now. And we never know why the given changes are on the table. So what is pretty smart, I mean, from the Fidesz side, is that they create a lot of problems when they create a new system. And when time comes, they may say that, oh, we have some problems, we have to solve them. And they start to do this kind of cherry picking, that they take one from the many problems and they try to solve so-called problems that they created. And then they can say that, okay, this is what a lot of people problematize. That's why we try to solve them. However, there are nothing more beyond these reforms than political intentions. And what is pretty interesting, that we can identify a lot of manipulative strategies and frauds behind the reforms. So the reforms themselves serve as manipulative strategies and frauds, especially for voter preference formation and voter preference expression. Now let's see the concrete issues, if I still have a couple of minutes, hopefully. Constitutional Court criticized the lack of delimitation process several times, also in 2005 and 10, and it was already on the table when Fidesz came back to power in 2010. And also we knew from European Court of Human Rights case law and Venice Commission documents that what should be done in general. However, still now, though we have distorted constituencies in that way, that the legal principles that are also in the fundamental law and the electoral law are not respected. For instance, let me give you two examples. The first is that the law explicitly says that electoral boundaries, district lines, cannot go through geographical boundaries, geographical limits, of course. For instance, like through a river. However, Danube River is not there, in that sense that we have a couple of districts that lay on both sides of the Danube. Though Danube is a geographical boundary. Also, there is no respect for putting regions together. In some districts, what we say is that we have a huge city and the surrounding suburban regions are added to the district in order to balance the city voters who are pro-left voters. They add suburban right-wing voters to the district, while in other cases, where the city is a stronghold for Fidesz and outside suburban regions are not that much, then they cut the suburban regions from the city districts and they create individual city districts. So there is no consistency in the geographical delimitation process. I intentionally didn't add maps into my presentation because I don't think it would say anything for you. However, in the paper I have some that can explain the obvious distortions and frauds of the map making. We had two delimitation process. Okay.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. We had two delimitation processes, 2010. One was 2011, the second was 24. And none of them had prior deliberation or social consultation, neither with experts, no opposition parties, no stakeholders were involved, not even electoral management bodies who have some expertise background. They were not involved in the process properly. And the biggest problem is that, or one of the biggest problems is that literally no one knows who actually prepared the maps. So we have no access, no basic information about the, let me use this word, perpetrators of the documents. They are just introduced by a member of parliament from Fidesz, from the governing party, and then overnight or within 2 days, it is passed and we have a new map and we have to accommodate ourselves to that map. Here, this is the final slide of mine. And I guess this is the first time that I finish a presentation in due time in my life. Here you can see the comparison of electoral reforms. And what is pretty interesting for me that the first one comes from a non-democratic system to a democratic one. The second and the third, the second is a de-democratization process, and the third one is a non-democratic situation. Why it is important, it's because if we want to overcome the system, we have to change the electoral system. And I think that it is the most important part is not to have a good electoral system, but to, my idea is, which is the very same that this project has, that we have to regulate somehow, we have to codify somehow the proper reform process. And if we have a proper reform process, any frauds or manipulation could be easier to avoid than to regulate the given elements or units of the electoral system. So in a nutshell, this is the horror story of Hungary, and I am happy if I get any interesting feedback. Thank you very much.
Miss Unger, not much to comment after your story. I will gladly pass the floor. I will gladly pass the floor to Mr. Rekai Rusinga from the University of California, Davis, who is the discussant, who went through the papers and will share his feedback with you and with the group. And after that, the recording will stop and there will be a question and answer session where we can freely speak about what the participants, the general participants here would like to say. So without further ado, I'm passing the floor to Rekai. Rekai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Darko. Thank you, all of you, Leontine, Anna, and Narda. I hope I said your names correctly. My apologies if I didn't pronounce your names correctly. Thank you for the very illuminating presentations. I think there's quite a lot to learn from all three presentations. In the case of the Netherlands, Peru, and of course, Hungary. I think I'll start with the first presentation, the Netherlands. I think this is a very good presentation. This is a very good paper. I read the paper and I also listened to the presentation. So good job, Leontine, on producing such an informative paper on the situation regarding electoral reforms in the case that you're focusing on in Peru, and for providing that detailed analysis focused specifically on e-voting in the Netherlands. I think I have just two comments, and these are suggestions for what I think you could consider doing to further strengthen your paper, which, like I said, is already a good paper in terms of the review that it provides, considering the theme of this conference that we are gathered here for. The first one, I think, would be you have a very good description, a detailed description of the electoral system, how it works in your case, and the electoral procedures also. I think you do this under the section where you have the subtitle electoral system. So that's quite detailed, the electoral system, the procedures. But maybe one thing that you may want to consider doing would be to say a bit more about the democratization trajectory in your country. I think that will further strengthen the paper in that it will provide the context to the next section that you then enter into, where you are going to discuss the process as it relates to e-voting in particular. So, like I said, the paper is quite good, but this is just one area that I think you could revisit, consider doing that to further strengthen your paper. The second one, I would say, you have a discussion, which is again quite good, which is commentable, on whether the principles for democratic electoral reform were followed. And I think the consensus, or rather the position, looking at this paper in particular, is that they were largely not followed. But I think one thing you may consider doing would be to beef up that discussion. And I think a good place for you to add in some details would be to do this before you get to the conclusion, because you have this discussion, but I think it's clearer in the conclusion where you are tackling these issues in terms of the adherence of the process to the principles that we are discussing. So I would suggest saying a bit more about that in the body of the chapter itself, and then summarize it in the conclusion. So you really get the opportunity, the space to explain in what ways you think the principles were not followed in a bit more detail than you currently have in the paper. And I say this, I know, like you indicated, the paper that you shared is still work in progress. So you might have already addressed this. But I think those are the two areas that I thought maybe you might consider revisiting to further strengthen this very good paper that you presented. With that, I think I will move on to the second paper that was presented, which was on the case of Peru. Again, quite illuminating, a very good study, a very good case there. And I think in summary, what the paper is saying is in Peru, we are looking at a case of a rushed reform process initiative, and the PASO in particular, which those who were pushing for it said it was intended to strengthen internal party democracy as it relates to party primaries. But it was introduced and repealed without careful consideration of the evidence. And I think there was a great deal to learn in that regard from Argentina, where this idea seems to be deriving from. And there was no broad inclusivity in the process. There was no consensus in the process. There was no transparency. There was no accountability, which I think is something that is common. If you look at the first case that was presented in this one, so far, this is what we see, a non-compliance with these principles of democratic electoral reform. So, and I think what stood out for me is, in the case of Peru, the executive-legislative conflicts. I think that's a very big issue, a key factor in determining which reforms get to be passed, which reforms don't get to be passed. And basically, I would say, in also just determining how the electoral process, or the electoral reform process rather, goes on in this particular country. And you seem to link this to the fact that the system is semi or semi-presidential. So for me, I think that also suggests a factor that we might look at if we are considering what are the possible factors that would explain variation, maybe in what we see in terms of the implementation of electoral reform. So maybe one key factor would be to look at whether there is some variation that is accounted for by the different systems, including this semi-presidential system. So you do a very good job, in my view, in my assessment, at providing the historical overview of the electoral reform process, a very good job at analyzing the case study that you are focusing on, and providing an assessment of whether you think the the principles were complied with. And you also identify the barriers and what you think could possibly have been done to avoid those. So I think you did a very good job. You did a very good job in my view. And lastly, Anna, in the case of Hungary that we're talking about, again, a very informative paper, a very good overview of the delimitation process and the associated reforms. So you have a very good paper there, you have a strong paper there. One thing that I think I would say that I think you may consider doing to further strengthen this paper would be to discuss in more detail, like you did. I know maybe there was no time for that, for you to do that in this presentation, but you could be more elaborate, I think, in my view, in terms of explaining the ways in which the reforms did not comply with these requirements that you would expect them to be guided by, and that is the principles of democratic electoral reform. But you have a quite strong paper there. One other thing that you may need to consider doing for the case study in particular, the delimitation. I see we have three sort of, if I'm not mistaken, periods that you are looking at, which I think is fine. It's still the same process, the delimitation process. It's the reforms relating to that particular process in your case. But I'm not sure whether you want to keep it that way. This is just for you to consider. It's just a suggestion, not to say it suggests that there's anything bad with what you're currently doing. But maybe you may want to consider what will allow you to get into more detail in terms of explaining the compliance of that particular reform process with the principles that we are considering. Whether you should maintain the 3 different years in which there was some movement or some action in relation to electoral reform as it relates to delimitation, or maybe you want to zero in on maybe one period in particular. It could be a year of the 3 that you have. So that would just be my suggestion. But otherwise, good paper, and all of you, congrats for a very good job that you all did. And I think what we are drawing from the studies that you presented on, the cases that you presented on, is these principles were largely not followed. And I think one theme that is running through all the presentations is there was no careful consideration of the reforms that were to be implemented, and the process wasn't that inclusive, which I think is problematic because it doesn't then lead to those reforms that would be desirable from a normative perspective. So those would be my remarks, and I think I can share my feedback with you in writing, after this meeting, but for now, I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much.